In the community where I grew up, if someone said vile things about you or slandered you or talked badly about you, it didn't mean that you'd done anything particularly commendable for Jesus. It meant that Miss Lucy, sitting on her front porch, had gotten mad at you and set loose with the gossip line. Hardly a noble thing. 1980, we moved to Richmond, Virginia. It was a real blessing because we'd left the Great Dismal Swamp and the capital of the Confederacy looked pretty good. People immediately began telling me what I had to see of historic value, and there was a long list. One of the things that was on that list that kept popping up was, you got to go to Hollywood Cemetery. You got to go. Interesting people buried over there. I never really met interested people in the cemetery, but in their time they probably were. Spring came, and sure enough, we decided one day we'd go over to see what was there, and we stopped at the little information center at the gate. There was a woman who obviously was a native Virginian. I'm sure she was southeastern Virginia because she had that strange OU sound when she talked about a boot. And she began telling us who was buried there and what we needed to see, and then she said with great eloquence, and 3 of our presidents are buried here. I thought, okay. So we took the little map, and if I remember, it wasn't marked who the presidents were, just it had presidential grave. So we went wandering, and we found the first, President Tyler. I remember that from school. I remember. We got to the second one, President Monroe. He did some interesting things. I remembered that. But then we couldn't find the third and couldn't figure out exactly what it was. And then as we drove to a spot, it occurred to us that after all, this was a true Virginian speaking, that when she said 3 of our presidents are buried here, she also meant Jefferson Davis. I personally thought that history was some time ago. But in Virginia, they still kind of referred to it, the old timers, as that recent unpleasantness. We walked to the tombstone, and engraved on the tombstone was the following: "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." And I got to say, I may have come from the sticks, but that didn't seem so sophisticated to me. Having been raised in a church that you were taught that Scripture not only was primary, but it was practically everything, who Jefferson Davis was and what he represented did not look to me anything like righteousness. Which brings me to one of the points about this final sermon on the Beatitudes. We need always to be careful. No matter who we are, we need to be very careful in discerning what the righteousness of God and the intentions of God truly are before we go throwing that term around. Because I can tell you, and nobody said to me that I know everything about the mind of God, but I have a pretty good inkling that whatever that looked like, it wasn't anything to do with righteousness. So we need to think clearly about what's the criteria for righteousness, and then we have to struggle with what it means to be faithful with righteousness. And then we have to deal with the part that's uncomfortable about this text, and that is where it all leads us. The primary text is verse 10, but lumped those two other verses together because this really does mark the end of the Beatitudes in the 5th chapter of Matthew. For some, there's a feeling of ambiguity because there's "for the sake of" thrown in. But this is truly a text that says clearly that blessed are those who are persecuted for the cause of righteousness or righteousness, because that is the work of God. To build a world where God's righteousness, justice, mercy, fairness, inclusivity reign. Now, Christians would insist in the day that this was written that their conduct was a direct product of their faith in the living one, and they were on the way. And therefore, the persecution that came their way was a product of following Jesus. Pagans with their polytheistic systems who simply had to worry about appeasing God or getting God's favor for their crops or whatever it may be, whichever God they may worry about at any given time, they didn't care much for these kind of beliefs because it didn't matter so much. Matthew probably is pointing to faithfulness as the cause of hostility. And I find it interesting that the first and the last of the Beatitudes are the ones put clearly in present tense. Now, right now, that we are in the realm of God right now. Blessed are those who are persecuted right now, in the present, in this real moment and real time. For they will see. No, they are part of the realm of God. Jesus knew what Matthew had to learn from him during his days as a disciple. If you stand for justice, there will be a price paid for the standing for justice. Matthew's Jesus has no time to blame the persecutors on Facebook. I mean, that may be a good outlet for us. Oh, they're talking badly about us in our group. But social media that day was what was taking place in the streets. Matthew had no time for people who were going to stand around worrying about all of that. He's saying to those who will listen, you can be happy, truly blessed, in a blessed state. And you can experience right now, in this present moment, not just someday, the rule of God in your life and the world in which you live. So verses 11 and 12 then go on to tell followers of the way to live joyfully amid the misunderstanding and the slander. To live joyfully in the realm of God, because if you are in God's presence doing what God wants, there is a true joy built into that. Richard Rohr points out that bad people didn't kill Jesus. Rather, conventional wisdom killed Jesus. Jesus taught an alternative wisdom to that was around during the time of the Pax Romana. The social order of the day was not as God intended it. Prophets and wisdom teachers, and I would say through the ages poets, were able to let go of the egos and all of that stuff and claim that vision of what might be, what things might look like if people took time to align themselves with what God was up to. Anna's working this morning, so I can say this. Her old boyfriend, Jordan, he was a kid. I liked him. He was really neat. He had grown up in the city, but he had a favorite phrase. And so when When we went hiking, I remember in a little state park south of Dallas. Even when we went down and marched in the Martin Luther King Day parade in South Dallas, which was predominantly a black area of town, and Jordan was African American, Jordan would say, if he was the least bit uncomfortable, "I'm terrified." Now, there's a few moments I would have jumped in with Jordan and said, "Me too." But most of the time, not so. But I think that Jordan represents where a lot of people are when things become uncomfortable. When the values we hold to be true get challenged by conventional wisdom, then it's easy for us to simply get reactive and jump out of our skins and say, "I'm terrified." Because in those moments we have not learned to trust that the Spirit will be in those places, granting to us comfort and strength to walk through those particular valleys. And therefore, I find across the land, historically, that we as church people have often sat quietly in our pews while the oppressed continued to be oppressed by people who operated by what they thought were conventional values. The realm of God is marked by a place and a table that's so long we can't even envision it. Filled with people who look like nothing we've ever even imagined through the centuries. Who have interesting beliefs beyond what our beliefs may have ever been. Who have interested opinions unlike any opinion we may have ever held. But everyone is invited to God's table because that's what the realm of God looks like. I found it interesting this week, and I'm going off script, so it'll make Chris nervous. I found it interesting this week that now we have a branch of our government has set up a commission to investigate persecution of religious groups, particularly Christians. And one of the first persons who was appointed was a man who's lived his whole life and made money out of an organization dedicated to working with all of his might and strength to withhold basic human rights from another group of people. And I find it hard to believe that when Christians go around whining about how they're persecuted, that so often I'm scratching my head and wondering in Birmingham and in Selma and in places across our city when people in times and places were standing up, being mocked and spit upon and truly persecuted, where the people of faith were who supposedly think they're being persecuted today. We need to hear the Beatitudes as if they were the stuff that can give us the vision we need to be who we were meant to be. We need to claim something beyond the warped righteousness of people like Jefferson Davis. And wow, the list gets long if you ask me. It needs to move past people deciding, well, we want this person in and that person out. It needs to move past assumptions about how people ended up in their economic class. It needs to move past our conventional wisdom that got passed on from God knows where with no basis of fact. Why people are who they are and why they didn't have the guts to go get an education like the rest of us. We need to find some way as the people of God to stand up and be counted, because when we are counted and lift up a counter vision, God is served. And we are part of the building up of the realm of God on earth as it is in heaven. Live faithfully. Be transformed by the values and the wisdom that come to us from the ancient words of the Scriptures. Experience persecution if we must. But remember this: for those who are faithful, being faithful and true in and of itself leads to a blessed state. I had a conversation this week. I have conversations all the time. That's why it's good to be here. You people, you like to talk almost as much as I do. This conversation was about the reactivity across our land and across the world, really, that's going on as people struggle, try to pull back together everything into ways that they thought they should be with homogenized view of societies. The reactivity and the fear. And I said, it's interesting because I get terrified with Jordan sometimes. But mostly, I don't get so terrified about what all the various components who identify themselves as Caesar are. Rather, I have this sense that whatever comes, however it may be, for better or for worse, that being in the work with God is, and I don't mean about that being a pastor, I mean as a human being in the work of God, is what it is because I feel that God is with us in those places. And if we feel God is with us in those places, we have courage, integrity, voices to speak, hearts full of love, and the capacity to do our work without creating more chaos. Blessed are those of you persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed, for you are part of the realm of God right now.